what do you do when a disease is everywhere? And what's responsible for that? I mean, it must be some amount of divine wrath that is essentially unprecedented.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. In 165 AD, the Roman Empire was enduring a period of seemingly unprecedented prosperity and stability. Then, the Antonine Plague arrived, bringing with it chaos, death, and fear. Colin Elliott is Professor of History at Indiana University and the author of a new book on the Antonine Plague, Pox Romana. In today's podcast, he speaks with James Osborne to dissect the impact of this devastating plague on Roman society and questions whether it was even the cause of the empire's eventual demise.
Today I'm with Colin Elliott, Professor of History at Indiana University, author and host of the Pox Romana podcast. Colin, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be with you, James.
Your book, Pox Romana, is really an account of the impact of the Antonine Plague on the Roman Empire. But I wanted to start by asking you to set the scene of the state of the Roman Empire at this period in time, just before the plague emerged. What are its economic, social and military successes and challenges, and who's in charge?
Sure. So let's look at the year AD 161. So this is the middle of the 2nd century. The Roman Empire has been in the midst of an age which we now call the Pax Romana, which is a period of relative prosperity and stability politically and economically. Even culturally, there is a sense in which the Roman Empire is becoming less of a conquest empire and more of a kind of commonwealth in which there is a gradually unified culture and economy spreading across 3 continents, so Europe, Northern Africa, and western part of Asia into the Middle East. And this empire is ruled by 2 emperors in AD 161. One is Marcus Aurelius. He takes over, philosopher king, studious man, a man that was really groomed to be Roman emperor. And then also with him is his adoptive brother, a man named Lucius Verus, who's a bit younger than Marcus Aurelius, a little bit more adventurous, a little bit more of a military man. But between the 2 emperors, the empire seems like it is in a place that is better than it has even been during this period of the Pax Romana, where Marcus Aurelius is going to rule at home in Rome, manage things carefully and wisely, and then Lucius Verus is going to go off with the military and fight wars along Rome's border, keep the empire safe, and maybe even expand it a little bit. So Rome is doing very well. It can support a major war against Persia. Its economic and monetary system is good. Its political system looks like it has never been better. Now, that is kind of the received wisdom of the age. It does get a little bit more complicated, as the book sort of explains. But if you're an elite Roman living in the year 161, you probably are looking largely at that situation. Things look very, very good.
Then the Antonine Plague arrives. What do we know and what don't we know about the emergence of this plague? What was it, and when do we first see evidence of it?
So I mentioned that the received wisdom is that, there's this idyllic period. And Edward Gibbon described this age as the most happy and prosperous age in all of human history, not just in Roman history, but in all of human history. But it's worth saying that despite kind of these superficial images of peace and tranquility, there are some issues. There are food supply issues. The Roman economy is nowhere near as robust as we might think it was. The Roman military had in many ways grown sluggish and was not sort of up to fighting form as it had been in the past. And there were some pressures on Rome's borders. And so when the pandemic arrives in 165, it does not necessarily find a Roman Empire that is actually as strong as we think it was. Now, how it gets to the Roman Empire, this is a matter of some controversy, but in my own research, it does look like the entry comes from the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Either it emerges there and then spreads from there, or it emerges from outside of the empire and then comes in. There are a couple of ways that it probably does this. One is because of the Pax Romana, its impressive trade links, not just within the Mediterranean, but outside. There are goods and people coming into the Mediterranean through Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the deserts along the border with Persia, and there are overland routes there. So that's obviously a possible source of disease transmission. The other route, which seems at least as likely, if not more likely, is Lucius Verus takes tens of thousands of Roman soldiers from Europe and other parts of the Roman Empire into Persian territory, marches them down the Euphrates. Well, actually, he doesn't do it. One of his subordinates done. Lucius Verus is a bit of a partier, so he just hangs out in the city of Antioch, right on the border, goes hunting, sleeps with women, gets drunk, and actually it's his subordinates that go into Persia. But we're told in several literary accounts that they encounter some kind of new diseases there. The soldiers then come back after defeating Persia and bring this disease with them. And this outbreak of disease we then refer to as the Antonine Plague.
And we're using this term plague, but I'm aware that that might be quite misleading, actually. What do we know about what this disease actually was?
That's a really important point. We use the term plague in a kind of generic way, and really it's not the plague. It's not bubonic plague, which is what we see during the Black Death. We talk about the Antonine Plague just as a colloquial term. Really, we have no idea what disease it was. I still don't know what the disease is. So what we can know really are the symptoms, and we can know that it was contagious and it was obviously very deadly. So we have the Greek physician Galen, who writes copiously during this period. He treats victims that have whatever disease was responsible for the Antonine Plague, and he kept notes, and those fortunately survive for us. Now, a caveat with Galen, he's an arrogant guy, and he's very interested in how smart and how wise he is when it comes to treating diseases, and so he mostly writes about his cures rather than the actual symptoms of the disease. But we can tease out from his notes. There was a fever that hit victims. Many of them developed ulcerations of various kinds in the throat. They would bleed. They would get ulcerations inside their body. They would also get pustules on the outside of their body. And that is a red flag for disease historians, because pustules limits the types of diseases that this could be. And many historians have suspected that this was a smallpox or a pox virus of some kind. Unfortunately, we don't have the DNA evidence to confirm a smallpox diagnosis or a smallpox-like disease diagnosis. In fact, the genetic evidence suggests that it was not smallpox because modern smallpox is only about 500 years old. But it looks like something kind of like that. We don't know how many people it killed, but some of its victims do die, and it's very contagious, and it seems to affect the cities and the military of the Roman Empire. And so, again, don't know what disease it was, but it was clearly something that people remembered. And so we have numerous historical accounts, not necessarily describing the details of the disease, but describing the fact that it killed many people and, describes sort of the types of people that it killed and whereabouts in the Roman Empire it spread.
So we don't know precisely what it was, but we do know that it was awful. Before we get into its broader impact, can we judge what the initial response to the Antonine Plague was, if any, as it started to become a significant issue?
Yes, and it's a bit mixed. The city of Rome gets its first outbreak of this disease in the year 166. What happens is the soldiers that were in Parthia come back to their European bases in the year 165. And some of them are selected to participate in a triumphal parade. This is a great honor. There would have been thousands of the troops that would have been invited into the city of Rome, and this is a massive event. The soldiers march through the streets of Rome. There's a sort of circuitous route that hits all the major streets and major temples. The emperors would march with the soldiers. crowds of people, and Rome's population at this time is probably over 1 million people. So even if 10% of the population showed up to watch this parade, that's 100,000 people. So it is what we would now call a super spreader event in October of 166. And this disease seems to affect Rome immediately following that triumphal parade. The response to it is interesting. So in this first wave, the emperors in many ways have an almost ideal response, given the fact that they can't stop this disease. They don't have the medicine, they don't have vaccines, they don't have non-pharmaceutical interventions, right? They don't have any of those things that we have when we deal with pandemics. But what they can do is what they do, which is they deal with the bodies. So the bodies pile up almost immediately, and the emperors provide for the collection of corpses. They provide for new laws to prevent body dumping. This is a problem in Rome at various times whenever there are death events in Rome, whether following floods or disease outbreaks or other natural disasters. So they prevent people from just throwing the bodies in the Tiber River, in the sewers, stuffing them in the bushes, leaving them in alleys. So there's control of corpses. The other thing that they do, which is also just more symbolic, but it is a meaningful reaction, and that is they provide memorial services for the people that die. They honor them, so the elite victims, members of the Senate and other elite classes, are given statues by Marcus Aurelius, and their memory is memorialized in that way. For even the common people, however, there are still kind of mass funerary celebrations or mass days of remembrance, that sort of thing. We don't have the details of what exactly was done, but something like that occurred for members of the lower classes, just common people that died of this disease. So that's the initial reaction. Now, I said it was a mixed bag. There was another outbreak of this plague a couple of years later. Again, the emperors are present. This is not in Rome, though. This is in the city of Aquileia. Aquileia is up in the north of Italy, and the emperors happened to be there in the late 160s because they were going to fight yet another war, this time with the Germanic peoples that were coming into Roman territory from the north. So they were staging a mustering of their soldiers in Aquileia. Again, there's a lot of people there. There are some folks that are coming from the Persian Wars. There are also some new recruits from the towns and villages of Italy. So there's a mix of people that have had the disease and maybe have the disease. And then there are people that have never encountered the disease, and they're all smushed together in a city. So, of course, there's going to be an outbreak there. And there is. This time, however, the reaction is not, let's clean up the bodies, let's stick around, let's remind people of their dignity, let's engage in memorial services. No, what happens is studious, wise philosopher King Marcus Aurelius gets on his horse and books it out of the city as quickly as he can. Lucius Verus goes with him, and they leave so quickly that almost nobody is allowed to go with them. And we know about all of this because Galen was there, the physician. Galen, who at this point had become sort of the personal physician of Marcus Aurelius, even he was not invited to get out of the city with Marcus Aurelius. And so he writes this very embittered account of what happens after the emperors leave, including the fact that the winter set in, and in the cold and in the disease, many people in that city died, including soldiers and citizens of the city, but also Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius's brother, who escaped, could not outrun the disease, and Galen tells us that Lucius Verus also dies at that time. So, to answer your question, the reaction was mixed. Some pro-social activity, but then I think when everybody realized how bad this thing was, that gets chucked out the window.
So, whatever the understanding was of the plague, clearly there's this fear of it, right?
Yeah.
Of course, now when there's a pandemic or the spread of some disease, we all understand the mechanism of what it is and how it's spreading thanks to science and research. But it strikes me that this wouldn't have been the case for the Romans at all. What do you think their conception and understanding was of this disease that they were clearly terrified of? And what did they think was causing it?
So in the ancient world, this is true in Roman society. This is also true in the societies of the Greek world and in a variety of peoples that made up the conglomeration of people that inhabited the Roman Empire. The view of disease was not primarily medical. It was instead religious. So if a disease outbreak afflicted a village or even a city, or in some rare cases, a region, the initial assumption was that some deity or perhaps deities were upset or had not been honored properly, that there was some sort of impiety that had brought about the wrath of some kind of divine, supernatural, spiritual forces. And it was up to the people of that area to figure out which deities were upset and what the best way was to placate them. So there are scapegoating rituals that we have from cities. Everything from, finding some poor guy off the street and marching him out of the city and never letting him back in, to stoning him, to various kinds of animal sacrifices, setting up statues. There are all sorts of ways in which plagues and pestilences could be mitigated. Now, with the Antonine Plague, this is something that people had not experienced, because this is not a disease that is restricted to one town or city or even a region. Very quickly, people realized, because of the connectivity of the Roman Empire, news spreads, they realized that the same disease that is affecting people in the cities of Asia Minor is also affecting people in London, is also affecting people in Gaul and Rome, and it's affecting soldiers in garrisons in various places. And so what do you do when a disease is everywhere? And what's responsible for that? I mean, it must be some amount of divine wrath that is essentially unprecedented. What's happening to them is on a scale that they had never seen before and nobody had ever seen before. And so for them, the answer is we have to find some kind of almost global religious solution and a global religious cause. Now, that doesn't quite emerge during the Antonine Plague, but there are attempts to figure it out. For example, there is a guy named Alexander who is quite famous in Asia Minor, in the cities of Asia Minor. He's got a pet snake, which is probably not a real snake. It's like either a paper mache snake or it's a sock puppet or something. The accounts vary as to what it is. But he's this famous kind of celebrity folk healer, messiah, prophet. And he starts saying that his pet snake, who's, by the way, a reincarnated god, Asclepius, who's the god of medicine. So, of course, his snake would know the answer. So his snake tells him that if everybody in the Roman Empire puts some magic words on a necklace over their door, writes it down, then this will cause the pestilence to go away. And we see inscriptions in Asia Minor that have versions of these magic words. We even found an amulet, even all the way over on the shores of the Thames in London, that has these magic words in it. So his cure clearly becomes a kind of Roman Empire-wide solution. One of the things that we also see during this time, and it's unclear how much of a connection to the Antonine Plague there is, but I think there is at least some connection, we see a ratcheting up of persecution of various kind of outside religious groups. In Asia Minor, we have inscriptions where magicians are chased down and are sort of scapegoated for causing diseases there. But in other parts of the Roman Empire, we see an increase in the persecution of Christians. And as we know from accounts about this guy Alexander, Christians were one of two groups that refused to adopt Alexander's mitigation measures. They thought his magic words were stupid, that this was foolishness, that this is not the way to cure disease, and so they refuse to participate in that mitigation measure. There is a mass murder of Christians in Gaul in the 170s, and this pandemic, by the way, lasts at least until the mid-170s, so a decade, possibly more. 50 men, women, and children who are Christians are murdered in Gaul, in one city, Lugdunum. Their bodies are burned, which is exactly what would happen to sacrifices to gods of the underworld. So there's that interesting connection. We don't know if they were killed because they had the disease or if they were thought to spread the disease, but they are clearly part of a non-compliant group that would have been targeted as potential sources of impiety and wrath of the gods. And we know from accounts just after the Antonine Plague that Christians were being blamed for a variety of natural disasters, including disease outbreaks. So that may also be part of the reaction as well.
Because ordinary Romans believe that there's a divine cause of this awful disease, I guess we don't see the kind of behavioral changes that you'd expect to see today, for example.
No, not really. There are some medical cures that are tried, but these are, of course, very ineffective. So one of the things that people are obsessed with is urine. People think that urine is a great plague cure, especially urine that that comes out of children, boys. So you could see Romans just looking around for boys to just pee on their ulcerated skin. So yeah, there's an interest in leaves, incense, these sorts of things, because these are going to fill the body with good scents and they'll push out the bad air of plague. So there are these attempts to deal with the plague medically, but they're of course ineffective. But one thing that's common to both the pandemic that we just went through and the Antonine Plague is fear, right? People are afraid, and so that psychology is the same. And I think we saw in the current pandemic attempts to scapegoat people that maybe were not doing what people thought that they should be doing. That search for certainty in the midst of a climate of fear and uncertainty that we saw in our pandemic also occurred in the Antonine Plague.
In the short and medium term, while the plague is still spreading, I'd like to unpick a bit more about its broader implications. What direct impact would you say it had on the Roman economic system, and how did that then filter through to the rest of Roman society and the political and military landscapes too?
That is a really challenging question, and I don't want to leave listeners with the idea that the Roman Empire is sailing along and is doing just fine. A disease comes, and then that disease kind of topples the Roman Empire. It's more complicated than that. And so let me try to parse this out in a way which is comprehensible. When the disease strikes in 165, the Roman Empire goes very quickly into a general panic. It happens from the top level down to the bottom level. It prompts migrations. It creates military problems as soldiers die. So that's one of the direct effects, is soldiers die in larger numbers than they otherwise would have. What this means is that this war that the emperors were going to fight against these Germanic tribes suddenly goes from an probably easily winnable war, a war that would have been won in a couple of years. The border gets fortified and it's fine. That war turns into a quagmire, and it lasts the rest of Marcus Aurelius's life. His son Commodus is able to secure a set of treaties that does secure that border for a period of time, but that border will then, about 50 years later, become the main source of problems for the empire for the rest of its existence, and indeed will play an instrumental role in its fall. So does the pandemic cause all of that? Well, no, but it does accelerate soldier deaths, which prolongs the war, which then creates an unstable situation on that border, which then contributes to the fall of the Roman Empire. Or we could look at, you asked about the economy. as people die, and we don't know how many died, but let's just say it's a small number. Let's say it's 2% or 5% of the Roman Empire. That represents a significant chunk of Roman tax revenue. Those people would be field workers. They would be mine workers. They would be quarry workers. They pay a head tax. The produce that they create is also taxed, and in some cases directly, like the grain itself doesn't get converted into money and then paid into taxes, and then the empire buys the grain back. In many cases, taxes are increasingly becoming in kind at this time. So that grain, suddenly there are grain shortages. Suddenly there are shortages of stone. There are shortages of timber. There are shortages of metal. There are just a variety of goods that the Roman Empire extracts from its provinces that are now unavailable. So we see a slowdown in monumental architecture. We see a slowdown in building projects. We see a slowdown in money production. In high quality money production. We see an acceleration in debasement because as silver is not mined at the levels that it was, the emperors are not going to suddenly rein in their budgets. No government ever wants to cut spending. And so what they do instead is they debase their currency, which produces inflation. It produces other forms of economic dislocation and disruption, and really causes the economy to suffer. Fewer economic resources to go around, and a desire among those in charge of the state to continue to spend at existing levels creates a civil war for those scarce and increasingly scarce resources. So again, does the Antonine Plague cause the civil wars that follow? Well, not directly, but its immediate effects are to create this economic instability and scarcity, which then helps bring about conditions favorable to civil wars, and so on and so forth. So yeah, the direct effects are pretty significant, but then as the effects of the disease mix with these other things, war, debasement, migrations, civil war, political strife, this just creates a whole cocktail of crisis that ends the Pax Romana and ushers the Roman Empire into a period which historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. And it is a period in which many parts, not all parts of the Roman Empire, but many parts, suffer tremendously over the course of about a 50-year period. It is basically a sort of a generational crisis that occurs, and this pandemic is a kind of accelerant. It's like fuel added to a low-burning fire that causes it to then erupt and create this huge crisis.
We know that Marcus Aurelius is the last of the Roman Empire's so-called 5 good emperors. Do you think that Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus were particularly well equipped to deal with the Antonine Plague? Or are there other Roman emperors throughout history who you think would have managed it in a different and perhaps better way?
I think they are kind of in the middle. So let me give you examples of emperors that maybe would be on either side. So one of the emperors that seems to have done well is the often forgotten emperor Titus. Titus takes over after his father Vespasian. So Vespasian is the conqueror of Judea in AD 69. He takes over the Roman state in a coup after the Emperor Nero, and then there's a kind of tumultuous period called the Year of the Four Emperors, and he's the 4th emperor. So Vespasian takes over, rules for a good decade or so. His son Titus takes over, and in the early 80s, 80 BC or 81 BC, there is a disease in Rome. We're told that it is very, very severe. Something like 10,000 people a day die in that outbreak. We can't verify those numbers, but that's the number that we get from a Christian author named Jerome. We also have some catacombs where there appear to be plague victims buried, and we have coins that date to the reign of Titus. So it does appear that there really was some kind of huge disease event under Titus. We're told in a biography of Titus that he spends his own money lavishly to provide various forms of relief to the city of Rome during this disease outbreak. We're told that he seeks the gods on behalf of his people. This was an important role for emperors to play. They were a kind of intermediary between their people and the gods. And so what Titus is doing is he's not necessarily saying he committed the impiety, but he's recognizing that it's kind of his job to appease the gods. Whereas during the Antonine Plague, Marcus does a little bit of that, but there's also a sense in which the empire is just kind of left reeling, and people are very religiously kind of unsure of how they're supposed to respond. And so you get these kind of charlatans cropping up everywhere. We don't see any evidence of that under Titus. And Titus, by the way, is dealing with not just the disease in Rome that affects his reign, and he only reigns for a few years. He also has to deal with, if you remember, Vesuvius. So he has to go and aid Pompeii and Herculaneum. Well, they're gone, but he has to aid that area. And he personally goes down there. And while he's down in Campania and kind of the southern part of Italy, that's when the disease outbreak in Rome happens, and he has to head back. So Titus, as little as we know about him, seems to do a pretty good job. An example of somebody that does worse than Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus is actually Marcus's son Commodus. Commodus experiences an outbreak of disease in Rome in the year 190. Commodus has been ruling at this point for 10 years. Marcus, his father, has been dead for 10 years, and a disease breaks out in Rome. It might actually be the same disease that occurred during the Antonine Plague. We don't really know. We don't have a description of the symptoms. But whatever it was very severe. We have a Roman senator who was an eyewitness to this outbreak in 190 under Commodus, and he says that 2,000 people a day died in the city of Rome. So it was a very severe disease. Commodus just bolts out of the city. He leaves the city of Rome. He goes to his villa in Laurentum, and he essentially just has the city fend for itself. No mass, no statues, no funeral ceremonies, no attempts really to help the population at all. And then when he comes back to Rome, like a food riot has erupted. People are diseased and starving. He just decides to murder one of his subordinates and blame the subordinate for all of this chaos that's happened because he's left the city of Rome. And then if anybody knows anything about Commodus, they probably know that he was a gladiator, that he was a bit mad. Well, that phase of his persona actually doesn't really crop up until immediately after the outbreak that he flees from. And I theorize in the book that there's probably a connection there, that Commodus actually kind of gets his megalomaniacal personality from the notion that he survived this disease. And so he turns the suffering of his people into a kind of legitimization of his own godhood. And, because so many other people died, but he didn't. And so there must be something awesome about him. There might even be something divine about him. And so he just goes on this kick where he just decides that he's going to start renaming everything after himself. He's going to fight in the arena. He's going to dress up as Hercules and strut around the city of Rome. He's going to murder people because he can, because he's basically a kind of demigod at this point. So Titus, great reaction. Commodus, terrible reaction. I think Marcus and Lucius Verus are kind of in the middle there.
Okay, maybe like a B or a B+.
Yeah, B+, yeah.
So when do we see that the Antonine Plague begins to recede? And what do we know about how this happened? Was it a natural immunity that built up among the population, perhaps, or another cause?
So this is something that we can theorize about, but we can't know for sure. In my view, the disease lasts at least a decade. It goes from 165 to at least 175. Galen, the imperial physician, writes about it as still being active in 175. And then there is just silence. Galen doesn't write about it. No other source that we have writes about it. This could be because the disease vanishes because of exactly what your question implies, that enough immunity built up that the disease could no longer latch on to large populations and have these kind of epidemic bursts. That's one possibility. It could also be the case that the disease carries on, but for political reasons or cultural reasons, it's just not mentioned as much. Marcus Aurelius gets sick in 175 AD. He gets so sick that one of his subordinates decides to declare himself emperor because he thinks that Marcus is going to die. You do not want to have a succession crisis. And so maybe mentioning sickness and disease becomes impolitic. That's one possibility. Although how you control that for an entire empire, I don't know. But that's one possibility. The other possibility is just that the chaos of the age, the wars, the migrations, the food crises, there's a runaway slave epidemic, there is an epidemic of desertion in the Roman military. All these problems compound, and that maybe those start grabbing the headlines, right? That the pandemic, which had initially been so scary and terrifying in its first few years of existence, people just get used to it and they kind of accept that it exists, and it just stops becoming something that people write about, but it nevertheless continues on and just occasionally comes in waves. So we don't know. It either cannot latch on to the population of the Roman Empire and it just kind of goes away, or it carries on the slow burn and just does not grab the headlines because the crises of the age overwhelm it. I think those are your two most likely possibilities.
How do you think the ultimate fate of the Roman Empire might have been different, if at all, if the Antonine Plague hadn't occurred?
This is such a good question, and I love it because it's a kind of counterfactual question, which is just something that more historians should do. It's a great way to think about history, right? What if this had happened instead of this? It helps us isolate how important the thing was that actually did happen. So, if the Antonine Plague had not happened, the Antonine Plague, in my view, was a catalyst. It was an accelerant. It was not itself the cause of the end of the Pax Romana, but it sort of brought rapidly some things that would have occurred anyway, but just over a longer time span and perhaps in a more distributed way. What that means is it's possible that the empire could have adapted and coped to handle some of these other related crises had they been able to happen in turns and maybe in a more spread out way rather than all at once within kind of one tumultuous decade and a half. So does that mean the Pax Romana would have survived? I'm not so sure, because there were problems that pre-existed the Antonine Plague. The Roman state was increasingly interventionist. It was increasingly capricious. It was extracting vital capital from the cities of the Roman Empire, from the provinces of the Roman Empire. That is not a sustainable system in and of itself, even with or without a plague. You cannot have a state that is overmanaging, moving things around, taking from some and giving to others, and not have distortions in the economy. So the Roman economy was on a limited clock already, and that was going to happen without the plague. And I don't think that solutions to this level of capricious state power would have even entered into the minds of Roman emperors or other officials. If anything, what we see in the 4th century, where there is not a major pandemic, is probably what we would have seen in the 2nd century. Increasing bureaucratization, attempts to close tax loopholes, increasing militarization. I think those things would have been the favored solutions to the crises that would have occurred without the Antonine Plague. It's just that the Antonine Plague kind of brought them all together and created a crisis which it was not possible to fix, and which kind of caused this more abrupt change in the character of the Roman Empire from the Pax Romana period to this period of crisis. So without the Antonine Plague, I think those things still happen. Some of those crises might have been dealt with, But I think in the end, there was a tsunami, and the Roman Empire would not have survived its own intrinsic flaws.